Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Piano Pedagogy Podcast. My name is Jacqueline Beckoff, and with me, as always, is Arianne Lacra. I
Hello.
own High Desert Piano and Define Music Teacher, and Arianne owns Whittier Family Music School, both in Southern California. How are things going for you this week, Arianne?
Hi, Jackie. I'm good. We just had the solar eclipse, a partial eclipse, maybe 30 to 50% for us here in Southern California about an hour ago, hour and a half ago. I went outside, couldn't really tell anything happened. And in other news, I'm getting ready to sign a contract with I signed the contract with my venue for my recital,
Oh,
and I'm getting
congratulations.
ready to thank you. It feels like a big step getting ready to send out those invites to all the families of my students, and going to look into adding the venue name to my general liability insurance and all that kind of stuff. Fun stuff.
Gotcha. Gotcha. They don't require the event insurance?
I don't know. I think they said they were going to send me like an informational form on that since I've never done anything like it before. So I'm kind of waiting on that. It might be. It might be.
Gotcha. Are you a member of MTNA?
Yes.
They
Yes.
have if you do need the event liability insurance, they are partnered with a company for liability insurance at a bit of a discount. I don't remember the company though.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. Well, thank you.
I just reached out to them because I needed to get the insurance for my recital coming up in 12 days. 12 days. It's going to be on
Ooh,
April 20th. So I'm just
fun.
setting that up. It's exciting because we're moving to that new venue. We're moving to a community college rather than a church, and I'm super duper excited for that. But it's a lot more involved in terms of the planning and the contract, and everything is just way more involved. And then the day before the recital, I have an audition. The day before the recital, I have my audition to get back into grad school.
Oh my gosh, tell me about it.
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I've been working on the same pieces, the Beethoven Opus 2 number 1, the handful of Bach pieces from his E major French suite, and then melody number uh, 3 by Fanny Mendelssohn, romantic piece. And it's been good. It's been good. My fingers remember the Bach. My fingers remember the Bach. My fingers remember the Beethoven because I did them for my senior recital. I don't remember them though, so I gotta fix that.
Mm, your fingers remember. So you're in that stage of, transitioning from just muscle memory to now, more cerebral memory.
Yeah, more analytical memory. I'm not sure how far I'm gonna go into that. I'm certainly not gonna prepare as much as I did for my senior recital. Um, but I can do it sometimes. And I recall because it's funny because Professor Edwards is actually the person who taught me all about memorization because I had no inkling of how to memorize music before I got to university at the age of 24, which is wild. No one had ever taught me actually how to memorize. They just said, go home and memorize your music
Just
and
do it.
just do
Yeah.
it. And I just suffered for weeks because I thought I was just bad at this thing, but it turns out I wasn't bad at this thing. Just no one ever really told me how to do it. So I've been using a lot of chord maps. I've been doing a lot of chord maps. I love my chord maps. You can
Aren't
see
they
them.
great?
You can see them right here for people
Whoa.
watching. And my partner calls them my ancient runes because I'm scribbling here in literal Roman numerals, and they mean something to me, and they most certainly mean nothing mean nothing to them. But
Yeah, they do kind of look like ancient runes.
little carvings on stone tablets.
Yeah.
Um, But yeah, no, I'm excited. I'm excited. I have the week off from work after the studio recital. It's also my birthday that following week. So, it's been really good. It's been really good. I'm excited for this period of stress to be over and then getting ready for the next period of stress.
After this month, you can just heave a big sigh of relief.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to just kind of just kind of breathe. My studio is a mess. You can't see it right now because everything is behind the camera, but my studio is an absolute disaster right now because I rearranged the room for a studio workshop yesterday. I rearranged the rooms on
Oh,
the studio workshops on right before the recitals. I rearranged the room. I got a bunch of chairs in here. I make it feel a little bit more like an audience situation rather than a much more relaxed environment that I try to create for regular workshops. So that they can get more of a taste of the performance anxiety that they're going to be experiencing in a couple of weeks.
wow. Well, nice. You could have fooled me with that background. I was just admiring how everything looked back behind
Just
you.
don't look there and don't look here and don't look back there. And it's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, that's a cool idea, having a workshop that is kind of a little bit of a different vibe from your typical workshop, just to get students into that um, mindset of, hey, I'm going to be performing in front of an audience before the recital.
Yeah, with this was for the youngest age group. I do 3 workshops for each of the different age groups, teens, adults, and kids. And for the kids,
Wow.
I have this big sheet music rug, and I usually have everybody sitting on this sheet music rug, and we're on the floor, and so it's a much more chill vibe. But like I said, I like to try to get the audience. And then for the other age groups, I have a table that we sit at rather than this audience setup. But we're not talking about workshops. That is something that we need to talk about at another date. Today, we're talking about dynamics. Today, we're
Yeah.
talking about dynamics, a topic that the two of us are not entirely convinced that we can make an entire podcast episode about, but we'll see. I think we can make it work.
I had to admit, I'm a little bit skeptical that we can last an entire podcast episode just talking about dynamics. But knowing us, I think, at least for me, my conversation will probably meander, and it'll
Who
probably be
knows what
fine.
we'll end up talking about? I
I
know it's
know,
not going to be
seriously.
just dynamics.
We're
So
already off to a great start in that respect.
yeah, we've been talking for 10 minutes about nothing related to dynamics, so I think we are right on track for ourselves.
Woo!
um so how do we want to start this conversation about dynamics? When's the first time you mentioned dynamics to a student?
Oh, pretty early on. I have these flashcards that were made by Music for Little Mozarts as part of a beginner elementary learning kit. So it's a kit that I purchased that is literally like a see-through plastic kit full of flashcards, books, little teddy bears like Beethoven Bear and Mozart Mouse, just stuff for really little learners. But the flashcards can be used for anyone ages, I'd say 3 through 10, honestly. And two of the flashcards are piano, soft, and forte, loud. And so that's the first introduction to loud and soft that my students typically have with the flashcards. And then I'll just guide them in the first ever beginner lesson on how to create louder sounds and softer sounds if they haven't already figured it out on their own.
Do you name them? Do you do like in that first lesson, do you tell them what they're called, or do you just use loud and soft?
First lesson, depending on the age, I usually don't. I'll just say loud and soft in English and then introduce the Italian terms later, personally.
Yeah, when it's interesting what concepts we can teach, formally named and unnamed. Going down our first tangent, already record time, I think. Italian terms. Do you talk about the fact that they are Italian and why they're Italian?
Every time. Yeah.
I love telling the story about the fact that the piano, asking where the piano was invented. Do you know where the piano was invented? And sometimes they'll say the darndest things depending on their age group. But then going into the story of how you know Cristofori invented the piano, and the tale goes that he did it in his kitchen, and he happened to be Italian, and simplified it somewhat for the younger students, and saying that since the piano was invented in Italy, then and we're playing on the piano, we use Italian terms. For older students, I might go a little bit more in depth on that, and not say just because we started using Italian terms before the piano was invented. So it's a bit of a simplification. But I love telling that story. And they're like, "Where is Italy?" And I'm like, do you know what spaghetti is?" And they're like, "I love spaghetti. I love spaghetti. I love eating spaghetti all the time. If I could eat spaghetti and that was the only thing I could eat, I would eat spaghetti. My mom doesn't let me just only eat spaghetti." I'm like, "Yeah, spaghetti's pretty great. That's where the piano was invented, the same place that invented spaghetti." And they're like, "Whoa."
Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm glitching out. Hang on. There we go. Yeah, I mean it's really fun to talk about why musical terms are typically in Italian, especially when you get with the get to the older students and you can get more into the music history side of things. And as you said, we were using Italian terms to describe lots of different musical mm, yeah, words before the piano was even invented. And why is that? Well, probably in large part because of the orchestral and vocal traditions that that grew and evolved in Italy during the Renaissance. So
Yeah.
neat.
It's fascinating. But I'm on the same page as you with I introduced them very early, but I don't name them. I don't name them for any of my students the first time I see them, which is at the evaluation. I've discussed earlier at a previous episode on the podcast the composition activity that I do at my evaluations to get students creating artistic music at a very early stage. We spoke about that in one of the first episodes back when we were doing um, two topics per episode, and we
Mm.
had structure. Now we've just thrown away our structure. But
But now they're
but
fun.
what was that?
The podcast. Now the podcasts are fun.
Now they're fun. Yes, we've lost the structure and we've gained fun and all the friends along the way. That's the real treat. Um, so no naming, but it's the first full lesson after they sign up with me. For adults, I will name them. For older teens, I will name them. But I don't really. There's not really much of a point, in my opinion, in telling them the name of the term before I'm even having them looking at music, right? Because I don't have them look little kids. I don't have the little kids looking at music for a couple of weeks. So there's not really a point in giving them a vocabulary term, in my opinion, from that very first full lesson,
Mm.
when loud and soft work just as well.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, there's if you think about it in the scheme of things, I mean, if you where do you draw the line on how much information to throw at someone new, who's younger, who's being exposed to all these different concepts in more of a formal lesson setting for probably the first time. Uh, that could be kind of overwhelming. Um, but it really helps, I find, when there's some kind of music program at the school, and usually at that point, like if students have had music classes and they paid attention in their specials, then they already know what piano and forte are and what a quarter note is usually. So
Right.
that not always, but a lot of the time it helps. And then, my favorite part about really teaching dynamics is when they get to more of the middle and late elementary stage of learning, and you can start to speak about dynamics to your student as more than just the loud and the soft of it. You can talk about crescendo, decrescendo, all the mezzos, and I love seeing students get excited when you tell them that there's such a thing as fortissimo, for instance, or fortissimo or whatever. But to me, I think the most important thing is exposing students to the idea that dynamics are so much more than just about volume. I think it's also about the fortuitousness that you put behind a phrase. Uh, because why is it really called a dynamic? I might have brought this up before, but um, to me, the reason that we refer to them as dynamics in part is because a lot of times music can be a conversation between multiple voices. Maybe if we're thinking about a fugue, in which case I mean, just as in a family or a friend group, there are family dynamics and friendship dynamics. And so, in the same way, there are these dynamics taking place between voices. And you could even roll the visual performance aspect into this. You can roll the uh, kinesthetic movement aspect into the discussion of dynamics. To me, it's so much more than just volume, and dynamics is related to other musical expression like articulation and so on. So I try to make sure that my late elementary and intermediate students and everyone beyond knows the interconnectedness of all of these different ways to express the music.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of points. You brought up a lot of points, and I want to talk about them. The first one that I was interested in is reminded me of Richard Chronister. Are you familiar?
Yeah.
Um, Professor Edwards is an acolyte of Richard Chronister and his teachings. And I was interested because we have to decide how much information to impart about a particular subject, right? And there's I suppose there's two very extreme approaches that we can take to that. And then there's a more measured middle one. And I remember that when I first started teaching, I went way on one side of the extreme, and then I bounced back towards the other side, and I settled somewhere in the middle. But he has a list. Chronister wrote about a list of fallacies and principles of teaching, and I don't remember which number it is, but one of them was that we see everything about a topic, right? We have all of the context, and for dynamics, all of the things you just said, all of that, right? The phrase and the interplay and um, all of the range of different dynamic marks, and just the gestures associated with it, and just the wide range of everything having to do with just dynamics, right? And so we have all of this context. Entire chapters of books have been written about dynamics, and we know a lot of that. And then our student knows nothing in some cases, right? Maybe they've had some context given to them by music programs at school, but if they're a tabula rasa student, they know nothing, right? They are brand new. And we have a very big decision to make that very first time we start talking about dynamics with them. Or this goes for anything, really. But the first time we bring up the term, no, not even the term, the concept of dynamics, whether or not we're naming it or not, we have all of this context, and they have none of that context. We can obviously not give them all of the context that we have. That was my mistake. I didn't try to give them all of the context, but when I first started teaching, I did a lot of talking. I love to hear the sound of my own voice when I first started teaching, and still do.
Classic
That's why I edit a
mistake.
podcast. So I would over explain things, and I think that that's a thing that a lot of new teachers struggle with. That let me just tell you all this stuff. Let me just talk to you. Let me just tell you about this. Let's just go through all of them. So we have 5 dynamic marks. Basically, we have pianissimo, we have piano, we have mezzo piano, we have mezzo forte, we have forte, we have fortissimo. Right. So now we're going to talk about that, what that means, and we just keep talking, right, about all of this stuff, and then their head is just spinning. They are going to remember none of what we just told them, because telling is not the same as teaching, right? And then the other extreme is that you provide no context at all. You just give them a tiny fragment of information. Just that, for example, you could just say piano means soft, right? And not give them any other pieces of information, right? Just be like, I want to start really simple. I don't want to overwhelm them with too much information. So I'm just going to I'm going to teach them one dynamic mark. right? And that, of course, is too far on the other side because dynamics are relative. You can't really have one without the other, right?
Mhm.
Um, Now I'm much more in the middle with a much more measured approach. I know how much of my context they need in order to understand at their very basic level. And I don't want to give them too little because obviously teaching piano without forte is it's kind of weird, right? But I don't want to overwhelm them. So do you find that you when you were first teaching, you were on one extreme of that spectrum?
Yeah, I think most of us, myself included, when we first start teaching music, we need to avoid the temptation to over explain. And now that it's been, about 10 years since I started teaching piano, I'd say I can almost sense when, I get really excited about a topic and start to go there. And then my student, maybe if, especially if they're elementary age, I can sense the zoning out taking place in real time. And then I have to catch myself. I'm like, whoop, I'm doing it. I'm doing that thing that I used to do a lot 10 years ago, and it's happening now, and I try not to do it. But I mean, when a topic excites you, it's bound to happen at some point. Um, but you reel it in, and yeah, because we've all seen, the teacher from Peanuts, and how the young characters perceive that teacher. Womp 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 womp. We don't want to be like that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard when it's on a topic that you really enjoy. I really enjoy teaching phrasing, and I can just keep going. I if I'm not careful, I will give them multiple explanations or multiple models. That's a better word. Multiple models of phrasing. We've talked about, physics-based models, and we've talked about a bunch of different models for how phrasing can be taught. And
Mhm.
and sometimes I really like teaching phrasing. It's one of the most interesting things I think about the piano is taking that flaw of our instrument where we can't sustain a note, unlike almost every other instrument that exists. And we can't crescendo on a note. So taking that flaw of our instrument and making it into something that we can create beauty with, and I'll just keep going. I will just keep going. And I've been gradually introducing phrasing earlier and earlier for my older students because they're able to handle the explanation a little bit sooner. But I remember there was a night I didn't get any sleep the previous night, and that entire day of teaching was just a fever dream. I was, I was tired in the morning, and then I got my second win, and I had some energy, and then I got sleepy again. And then by the time 7 o'clock rolled around, 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock rolled around, and I had my last three lessons, I was way up here again. I was really high with my energy, and my filter was just gone. And I was
Mhm.
just kind of I was letting more of that passion and fascination with certain topics run my lessons because I didn't have that filter. But it was interesting because I think I may be too far on the other side. I might be too restrained because there was a lot of really interesting stuff that came out during those lessons.
Hey, yeah, and there are other factors too. It depends on your student. Lots of students appreciate that, especially adult students. A lot of them are willing to get carried away and go down a rabbit hole or a tangent with you about a certain aspect of music playing, and that to me is one of the many joys of teaching, like, more mature students.
Yeah, yeah, I love teaching the older students because they I don't know, they're just they're on you they you can speak to them on another level earlier on. You don't need to build as much of the vocabulary because they have more outside vocabulary. They have more outside contexts to understand music with. Whereas with children, um, high and low versus loud and soft. This is something that some of my students, one student in particular, uh, is struggling with, right?
Mhm.
Understanding the difference between high and low and loud and soft, right? She's very little, and um, I think that's an interesting dilemma when faced with dynamics, piano and forte, and pitch, right? Because
Yeah.
low volume is a perfectly valid sentence, is a perfectly valid phrase, right? I prefer my music at a low volume, or I love to listen to my music really high in the car, right? Those are both sentences that make grammatical
Yeah.
sense, right? But that's not how we use them in the context of music, right? We don't use them. That's not how high and low work in music. Have you ever run into that hiccup with students high and low versus loud and soft?
Definitely. Actually all the time. And sometimes uh on certain first lessons I'll say, all right, find the high pitched part of the piano, you know, and and sometimes the littler ones will actually go to the low pitched end of the piano because they with very sensibly they understand that the decibel rate is higher when you apply the same amount of pressure to like the lowest keys on the piano, um because the strings are longer, there's more
It's a bigger sound.
vibration. It's just a bigger sound, and so the work of explaining the difference between pitch and volume can kind of be challenging sometimes, especially if you're on um like an acoustic piano where the whole thing shudders when you play a
Right.
lower pitched note.
The activity that I've been doing with her is first of all, I introduced the treble clef and the bass clef way before any of the books that I use introduced the treble clef and the bass clef. We've spoken a little bit about preparation stage learning at a much earlier episode, but I introduced the treble clef and the bass clef before we get to the staff, so that they're already familiar with those symbols, and they're familiar with the fact that the treble clef means high sounds and the bass clef means low sounds, right? So the way that I do that for those of us who haven't listened, those are listeners who have not listened to that episode, or might need a refresher, is that I teach the symbols on a whiteboard, and I'll draw the treble clef, and that's a higher success rate that they've seen a treble clef outside of at some point in their life. Like a 6-year-old, there's a higher
Mhm.
chance that they've come across a treble clef in their life than that they've come across a bass clef in our life, because non-musical people will sometimes use treble clefs to represent the vague concept of music, right? It's a music
Yeah.
thing, right? So I draw the treble clef and I ask them if they've ever seen it. And if they say no, I will dramatically look around to the many decorations in my studio that have the treble clef on them. I think there's like 7 treble clefs hanging in my room. There's 3 on that wall. There's one over here, one over that's 5. There's 6 as well on my painting. So I think there's at least 6 of them in here, and I'll dramatically look around and be like, "Are you sure you haven't seen it?" And then we'll do the bass clef, and we'll talk about high and low, and then we'll draw them in to their music, the pre-staff music. For the right hand parts that are above middle C, I'll always have them draw in a treble clef, and then we'll do the bass clef. So that's the high and low, and but I do these sound pictures. I do these sound pictures. Some books, some of the books targeted towards younger students have sound pictures. Are you familiar with sound pictures?
um Perhaps maybe like with animals and stuff.
Yeah, you get first of all, you develop a couple different parameters, right? And the ones that I mostly use for these young students is high and low, so pitch, volume, and then length of the notes. So for example, thunder. Let's make a sound picture for thunder. Is that a high sound or is that a low sound, right? And this is a sound that young children are familiar with. Sometimes thunder is something that frightens them, so they're very acutely familiar with it, right? Is that a loud sound or a soft sound? Is that a high sound or a low sound, or is that a short sound and a long sound? And then we practice that. A mouse scurrying to find cheese. That's a high sound. It's a soft sound, and it's lots of short sounds, right? So it combines those 3 different dimensions of music: volume, pitch, and duration, and it gets them thinking about experiences that they may have seen on TV or things that they have may experienced in their real life, like a car horn, stuff like that. And that can be helpful because for each of the sound pictures, they draw in a treble clef or bass clef, they draw in forte or piano, because at this stage they usually know about forte and piano, and then they'll write in short or long.
Mm.
But some books have them, but some students, they'll also love to have a project to go home and come up with their own sound pictures and then draw a picture for their favorite sound picture to bring back to the studio.
Nice. Do you ever use your own voice just to demonstrate with singing?
Yeah, I'm not as comfortable with singing as I would like to be, so I don't sing as much, but I'll absolutely demonstrate, higher sounds versus lower sounds. My voice is a little bit scratchy today, so I'm not gonna torment anybody on the podcast. But high and low or loud and soft, yeah, those are absolutely things. And trying to get them to recreate that same thing with their own voice is a much more um, tangible thing than the piano. Do you? I know you
Yeah.
do.
Oh, every time we talk about high and low pitches for the first time, I will put my hand way up high toward the ceiling and, also pair that with like a really high pitched vocalization that I do. And then we'll go to the floor and do the lowest pitch I can, when I'm singing. And then I'll have the student do it and use their arms to kind of illustrate pitch difference. And then with right afterwards, we'll do volume difference using just one key on the keyboard and showing, well, one key on the keyboard at a time, one in the middle register, one in the high register, one in the low register, to kind of break that uh, misconception down and show that any key can be played piano
Right.
and any key can conceivably be played forte.
Yeah, that's a really easy activity to do. It doesn't take a lot of time, right? Pick me out a high key, pick me out a low key, right? And then let's make some different sounds. Can you make me a high low sound? Can you, or sorry, a high loud sound? Make me, or rather, I think it would be better to say loud high sound, right? Can you make me
Mm.
a soft high sound? Yeah, that's a really great um, activity for sure. And you can combine it with flashcards with the treble clef and the bass clef on it, along with the forte and the piano on it. Can we talk for a moment on another tangent here about how unintuitive just high and low are, right? I think that's the real thing here. It's not that the dynamics are unintuitive. I think that high and low is really the more unintuitive thing, right? Even the visual
Yeah.
demonstration of high and low, that's a really great for someone who's a singer, right? Because we can feel the singing being higher in our body versus lower in our throat. But for the piano, suddenly high and low are now right and left, right? Higher is to my right, but higher has always been up. Higher is towards the ceiling and down is towards the floor. Now, all of a sudden, when I move to the right, that's higher. And when I move to the left, that's lower. I think that is very unintuitive for young children.
That's why I have the youngest ones just go up the keyboard one key at a time a few times just so that they can learn it from the piano without me having to explain it. Cause I just like, first of all, not everyone knows their left from their right when they come into my studio at that
Right.
point. And so, you might want to grab a washable marker and just write a big R on one hand and a big L on the other if they don't. And that tends to help with parent permission, of course. And then, like, another thing they can do is just A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way up the keyboard a few times, just so that they understand it themselves without me even having to, like, abstractly explain it to them.
Right. I think it's definitely an explanation, like you're saying, is probably the wrong way to go about it, and
For
making it more
some.
of an experience. Yeah, for some, everyone's different, but certainly with children, getting children to experience things is the way to go. I have this big floor vinyl piano that it's 2 octaves. And I don't know, maybe it's longer than my yoga mat. It's probably I don't know, 7 feet long, maybe,
Is it the kind
8 feet
that
long.
students can step on and play?
To make sound? No, not to make sound.
Oh,
But
okay.
they can step on it. Yeah, they can step on it with like socks. And I have these big tiles that have these big round discs that have the letters on the alphabet, and like having them, make first of all arranging it in the same orientation. My studio is set up so that the pianos are over here and there's space over there. So I wouldn't want to have them facing away from the piano and moving, in an opposite direction. But like having it facing the same orientation as the piano, and then having them up the piano, walk up the piano, and then walk down the piano, and then taking the bench away from the grand piano and having them walk and play going up and then walk and play going down. I think that a lot of us, myself included, we don't get our little students off of the bench enough, right?
Mm.
We don't get them off the bench enough, and having things be in these big, large movements where they can physically move their body, and walk and play up and walk and play down. Or even for any activity where you're really all over the keyboard geography, just taking the bench away and having them be able to stand and walk and reach and interact with the piano on a more physical level, is I think it's a good approach for little kids.
Oh yeah. To all those teachers out there who are just starting out teaching students of all different ages, the biggest life hack that I can share personally is if your student has a lot of energy and can't sit still at the keyboard, just take them to the floor and do some kind of activity like that. And I bet you they will be so thrilled to do that, no
Ooh,
matter who they are and
yeah,
how much energy they have. If they can sort some flashcards in order from,
that's a
lowest
good
pitch
brand
to
name.
highest, or huh?
That's a good brand name. Flash chords
Flashcards.
for cards about music. Flash chords.
Yeah. Um, depending on what level they're at and that kind of thing, you can always get the conceptual work done on the floor and then come back to the piano, and by that time the student has gotten all of the jitters out of their system, and usually they're ready to be more engaged on the keyboard, um, and kind of going back to dynamics, pitch, things like that, uh, and going back to those, what did you call them? Sound drawings?
Sound pictures.
Sound pictures. Yeah, really engaging with sound pictures, I think, has helped me a lot. So if there's a picture of a bird, I just point to the bird and say, "Hey, can you make the piano sound like this little birdie?" And then I'll usually say tweet 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 tweet, just so that they are super
Right.
confident that the right side is going to be it. And if they accidentally go to the left side, it's obviously gonna, or it's clearly, it turns out to be not what they anticipated would happen. And then they go, oh yeah, and then they go to
Right.
the other side. Same with a lion's growl, and same with all those different pictures.
Yeah. I think that it's a really it's I mean it's a really cool activity. It could be a little competition you have in your studio with your little kids. Come up with two things. First, the best sound picture, and then the best matching picture for your sound picture, right? And it doesn't even necessarily be a competition. It can just be a group activity, that everyone's going to come into the workshop next month, and they're going to bring a drawing and a sound picture with them,
Mm.
and sound pictures in their head, and the picture's a physical thing, just to share with the group. But I think that it's great, and it's, again, we've talked about how getting away from the notation. This was when we talked about composition. We talked about how it's really useful to get away from the notation, or at least classical notation, to interact with concepts, because the notation is so complicated, and to be frank, none of it's intuitive. I don't think that there's a single intuitive element of of not composition, of notation, that someone can understand without explanation. Perhaps as notes go up the page, but I mean that's still something that we need to up the staff, up the piano, but then we get back to high level. Do you think there's an intuitive element to sheet music?
Well, I do in the sense that you can turn your page around 90 degrees and then it'll be a visual representation of the white keys.
Yeah.
But that's I feel like only certain students will get that, you know. And then which way 90 degrees? 90 degrees
Left or right,
clockwise
yeah.
or counterclockwise? You got to know, and it the bracket has to look like a mustache. I use that little example, like if your bracket looks like a mustache, then the staff is a visual representation of the keyboard. But honestly, like if your student can understand that sentence in itself, then they can understand vertical to right-handed correlation. I mean, so
Right. Yeah, you know,
it's like a useless little thing that I can maybe tell a beginner adult.
there's for some of my research that I did in university on the subject of annotations, I did a lot of research on symbols, and there are some symbols which are universal symbols. There are some certain symbols which are universal symbols, and people who make, well, people who design symbols for a living, they strive to have their symbol understandable without words, right? So most people can understand the handicapped symbol on spots, but if you didn't already kind of know that, yeah, it vaguely looks like a wheelchair, but it's not necessarily a universal symbol. Whereas a raindrop is much more universal, or a tree. That's a symbol which resembles an object, and that's kind of universal. You don't really need a label underneath the word tree. Sorry, the symbol for tree to know that it's a tree, right? But nothing in sheet music is a universal symbol. None of it
Mm,
functions without explanation or context, right? None of that functions because universal symbols are easily understandable across cultures. Different cultures need to be able to understand the symbol. Different languages, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic, they need to be understood universally, right? And sheet music is very much not that, right? Not a quarter note resemble. I mean, what does a quarter note resemble that tells us that it gets, nothing? So being able to stay away from that and get to just something that the child understands, like a bird. They know what birds sound like. They've heard a lot of birds, right? And using that bird as a symbol to represent a high sound, perhaps a softer sound, a short sound, being able to represent that with something that is tangible and understandable and universal to children is a very valuable thing.
yeah. Well, what do you do when students who have a solid understanding of the fundamentals of dynamics have to get into more of like the skill of balancing right and left and melody and harmony and balancing two different volumes, maybe one for each hand? I've encountered students who struggle to make their right hand melody louder than their left hand accompaniment and all that kind of thing. Do you have any hacks?
I have one. I have one that really works well. So I've never needed to look for a new one, and I call it shadow playing. Is that a term you're familiar with?
Actually, that was going to be my hack. You
I think we
stole the
got
hack
I think
right
we
from
got
me.
learned the hack. I think we got taught the hack by the same very nice lady at Cal
Yeah.
State Fullerton.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain it or shall I?
Go for it.
Shadow playing is a really great way to give the somewhat vague and esoteric concept of balance between the hands, which has a variety of success and failure states, right? Because you can have your left hand be somewhat softer. You can have your left hand be the same. You can have your left hand be louder. There's a lot of different ways um, to either succeed or fail at that, and all of the range in between. So it's very difficult because it's a concept that, again, we have the whole understanding, but a student lacks the full context, and you can't provide them the full context. So shadow playing is when you play one hand so softly that the keys go down, but they make no sound. The keys move down, but they make no sound. So what is the point of that? Well, it takes voicing or balance between the hands and makes it something that a student can very clearly hear. Okay, that's right. I hear no sound in the left hand. I hear lots of sound in the right hand. Typically, the thing that will happen the very first time when you ask a student, you explain this is what shadow playing is. Go ahead and play the left hand so soft that we can't hear it, and play the right hand so that we can still hear it at the right dynamic level. They'll probably drop both hands in volume, right? They'll probably drop both hands in volume. But they'll eventually be able to figure it out because, well, I can still kind of hear the right hand, but I can't hear the left hand at all. All right, well, let's see if we can increase the right hand volume, but I still don't want to hear that left hand at all. And a happy little accident sometimes happens. Sometimes they go in and they're like, okay, I'm going to shadow play. I'm going to make this left hand so soft that I can't hear it. The right hand's going to stay forte. The right hand stays forte, and the left hand is piano. And I'm like, congratulations. You just skipped all the work. You did the thing we were originally trying to do.
Yeah, I think that balance happens a lot more naturally for some students. I mean, some people pick it up immediately when they're first introduced to the concept. Others might get it in theory, but it's harder to put into practice. And that's where I think shadow playing is such a great little pedagogical hack.
I use
Um,
it for my own practice.
yeah, and if for whatever reason that doesn't work, then hands separate and then together practice can sometimes do the trick with certain repertoire, although it's it really depends on the situation.
I am vehemently against hands alone practice. I could rant against hands alone practice for an hour and a half.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yes, I hate it. I had when I was a young student, my teacher had me learn every piece, every single piece, left hand by itself, right hand by itself for an entire week. And then I'd
Mm.
be allowed to bring it back and try to put it hands together. And it really is just playing hands alone versus playing hands together is just it's two completely different experiences. I'm not against it for use within a practice session,
Okay. I was
and
gonna
okay,
say,
bringing it back to being hands together is by the end of the segment of whatever they're working on is a necessity for me. But for phrasing for voicing balancing between the hands, it's certainly a useful tool to get to the right sound. It's a good tool to get to the right sound, but like I certainly would never ever assign a student to work on an entire section or an entire piece with only one hand
for
um,
an entire week.
for an entire week. Yeah, I
Yeah,
would
no,
much
that's
rather, because it is one of the ways of controlling difficulty, right? I tell my students that they're responsible for controlling the difficulty of their practice, and for the older students, I tell them um, in a kind way that mistakes don't happen in a vacuum, that when they make mistakes during their practice, that's not it's not an inevitable consequence of practice. It is a consequence of poor practice decisions.
yeah.
It is essentially, in a nicer way, I say it's their fault that they're making mistakes because they need to make it easier for themselves. Well, how do they do that? Well, they practice fewer measures. Instead of trying to play the entire piece all at once, they practice a small section. Well, they can go slower. They could go hands alone, but that's certainly one way to control the difficulty. But I feel like it's not a useful one.
I think within a lesson or within a practice session, hand separate practice can be uh really useful in learning the different parts and just getting acquainted with the piece, maybe getting prepared to sight play it hands together for the first time, or do a run through for the first time hands together. But yeah, it's important to get the hands back together before the end of that practice session or lesson, in my view as well. Otherwise, you run into issues and create issues that you'd never even maybe run into
Right.
in the first place if you just learned it hands together from the very start. Another factor too, when we're talking about balance and dynamics where one hand just needs to be louder for a certain phrase and everything. If if you have a left-handed student who's having a hard time with your typical like, oh, right hand melody needs to be drawn out, then I would maybe encourage you to like embrace their left-handedness, speaking as a left-handed person, and just find repertoire where the melody is in the left hand and see if they gravitate to that a little bit better just for your first few pieces that require balancing like that, you know?
Yeah, I want to touch one last thing on left hand, right hand, hands alone practice, that concept before we continue on what you were just saying. But I feel like if you have followed good pedagogical structure and good ordering on your repertoire, the shift from left hand or the shift from single note melodies that go between the two hands, for example, in the very early elementary music, it's that shift is so gradual, right? The shift between, okay, we're playing, just right, just one single note melodies, to, okay, now we're including a couple left hand notes at the same time we're doing the right hand. All of a sudden, now we're not all of a sudden, gradually now we're doing chords, and it's such a gradual shift that the like I think that the reason why I was told to do hands alone practice is because I wasn't really given the gradual increase in that complexity level as a child, and
Yeah.
it was something that, like, I wasn't really ready. I mean, that sounds silly, but I wasn't really ready to be playing the hands together repertoire. I wasn't capable of doing the things that needed to be done to play music of that complexity level. So instead of building me up to music of that complexity level, she made the music easier in the wrong way, right? She never really tackled the root
Mhm.
cause of the issue.
That's a fantastic point. I think that's one reason that I'm a huge advocate of the Faber method books and just others that include melodies that both hands can participate in at first. That's a really important point. Like I had a transfer student recently whose old teacher assigned nothing but hands together pieces with a melody in the right hand and accompaniment, chords and stuff in the left hand right off the bat. And when I tell you that student struggled so much to not only balance their hands, but even just comprehend what they were supposed to play, I was like, all right, you haven't even been exposed to pieces where the melody is shared between the right and left hands. Like this is overwhelming. Let's dial it back and change your method book. And it took a little bit of adjusting, but after a while, that student started to love the fact that they could just focus on one thing happening at a time at any given moment. And I was like, yeah, that's it was like a missing link in that foundation of their piano knowledge. So I'm happy to report that that student is still with me and doing a lot better than when I first encountered them.
Yeah, it's that foundation. I completely agree, right? I know this is often another tangent, and you'll have to remind me of what I said I was going to originally respond to.
Oh,
But with counting, right? Counting, and this is another topic we should definitely have a full session about, a
mm,
podcast about. Some students, using subdividing the beats using ands. Some students are very reliant on subdividing the beats. And I had this musicianship class in university, and it had a huge impact on me because the teacher was having us sight read rhythms, and the only thing we were allowed to say was the big beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, or if we were in 6/8 or whatever, 1, 2, or and then we were responsible for tapping or clapping. Well, it was tapping. We were responsible for tapping one part of the rhythm with our right hand and then the other part with our left hand. And so we were not allowed to subdivide the beats with our mouth. Essentially, we were only allowed to do big beats with our mouth. And then Chronister has a concept of slow counting and fast counting, which I've renamed because I think that they're terrible names. Detailed counting is when you subdivide every single beat.
mm,
And beat counting is when you only use beats. I don't allow my students to mix the two. I don't allow my students, for example, to say 1, 2, 3, and 4, because it's this weird thing where they're performing some of those rhythms with their mouth instead of keeping track of the beats. So I will say in a section, and I'll tell you why this is related. In a section, if you don't understand the rhythm, all right, well, let's close the fall board. Let's tap it with detailed counting. Once you understand that, we'll bring it back to beat counting. So you can subdivide those beats if you want to figure it out. But within that practice session, you need to bring it back to beat counting. I don't want you to do that for an entire piece of music. I would rather you figure out the rhythm in a very small section and be able to do that fluently, without relying on subdividing like a whole note, right? You shouldn't need to subdivide a whole note, right? And then bringing that back to more firm understanding. And with left hand and with hands alone practice, that's the same philosophy. I'd rather you have fluency in a small section than be half capable of the entire piece.
Huh, that's interesting. So if there are two quarter notes, then a pair of eighth notes, then another quarter note, you wouldn't have the student count 1, 2, 3, and 4?
Absolutely not. If they need to understand the rhythm, they can tap it and go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and as many times as they need to. But then I will ask them to go back to beat counting and they will perform it 1, 2, 3, 4. They don't need to subdivide they don't need to perform their rhythms with their mouth. They understand their rhythms. They're performing their rhythms already with their fingers. They shouldn't have to double it with their mouth.
Oh my gosh. That sounds like if I implemented it, that it would just go horribly wrong in my studio.
It is something that needs to be done from an early stage. It is something that needs to be done before eighth notes are introduced. As eighth notes are being introduced, I don't introduce them, and I'd love to have a whole episode on rhythm. I don't introduce them with ands at first. I'll just say, okay, let's tap some quarter notes together. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, let's tap some half notes. 1, 2, 3, 4 whole notes. And then I'll say, okay, let's go back to quarter notes. And now instead of only tapping one time every time you say a number, let's clap 2 times, right? I don't even tell them that those are eighth notes yet. I'm preparing them for that. This is weeks before they even see an eighth note. They're just going, okay,
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4. The first time they perform eighth notes, they're not using subdivision. Yeah. So I don't even in the books I'll cross out all the little plus signs in their books because the books don't trust them to do eighth notes without subdivision. But or they or like I hate it because they'll have a phrase that has a bunch of eighth notes and it ends with a whole note and they'll subdivide the whole note. Like, come on, you shouldn't be. Why is this isn't a piece in 4/4 anymore? You're an 8/8. Why are we counting like this?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, well, I don't know. Like for me, I tend to use rhythm flashcards with students who are just learning about eighth notes versus quarter notes, things like that. And I just tell them to think about it in tas and TTs until they get to the point where they can say, the numbers and the ands. And
See, I don't mean tas and TTs. That's fine because you're acknowledging there. You're saying you are performing the rhythm with your mouth. You are performing that rhythm with your mouth because you're saying it, right? Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. That's different than 1, 2, 3, and 4 because you're masquerading in that moment. Well, not you. I'm sorry. That's very
oh,
personal. We're masquerading and we're saying you're keeping track of your tempo. That's always what numbers have been since we got from counting 1 to 1 to 1 1 1 before. Once we introduce that we count to 4, we count to 3 in a measure, we tell them we're not keeping track of rhythm anymore. You're keeping track of your tempo. That's what you're counting now. You're keeping track. You're making sure you don't go too fast, you don't go too slow, and you're helping remind yourself that you get the right number of beats in each measure. But you're now performing that rhythm on the piano. I mean, I don't say that, but that's the concept. And then all of a sudden we introduce eighth notes and we throw that out the window. We're like, okay, we're back to performing rhythm with our mouth. And it's a mixture of, I mean, it is literally, it's just subdivision. I guess I'm not a huge fan of subdivision in performance. I want them to feel the big beat. And I think this is also back to I don't want to say trauma as a piano student, but I really, my failings as a piano student, I was terrible at rhythm. I was terrible at rhythm. I was terrible at counting, and I would subdivide all the time in order. And this was in college. I would subdivide all the time in college because I just could not keep my rhythms straight. I
Huh.
could not keep my big beats straight. I had no idea of how fast I was really going because I was keeping track of a tempo that was basically twice as fast. You're just doing it in double time when you're constantly subdividing. And I, you're absolutely right. The shift for current students over to the new model was very rocky. It was very rocky when I decided to do that. It was a very slow process. Some of my old students never made it over. Some of they never entirely made it over, and they do rely on the hybrid of subdivision and macro beats. But on all new students as well as transfer students that learn eighth notes, they learn them with this concept of detailed counting being a tool we use to help understand rhythms. And you do all of the subdivision, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then beat counting being the goal. And you always have to get back to beat counting before you stop tapping it, before you move on to another part of your piece, because it's not done yet.
Interesting. Yeah, there's something to be said about the significance of the strong beat when you're performing. And of course, once you get to the more advanced level, if you're using the metronome, you can try to just do metronome practice that is focused on strong beat only, or if there's subdivisions, then maybe you can have one of those metronomes that goes between two different kinds
Yeah.
of chime or tick.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. Well, I might try that.
We'll have to have an episode about I don't know what that would fall under, but I guess that's rhythm. I guess
Rhythm.
that's the whole thing about rhythm. But bringing it back to dynamics, I don't recall, and I apologize before that massive tangent. I don't recall the point that you made
Oh,
that I was responding to.
oh, well, if you're a left-handed, if your student
Yes.
is left-handed, then and if you find that they're having trouble balancing a piece that calls for a louder right hand than left hand, maybe all you need to do is find them a piece where their dominant hand can be the louder one, and they can learn balance that way. It could just be that they're very strongly left-handed. I know I was when I was learning, so I had a lot of trouble balancing right and left at first when I was kind of at that late elementary, early intermediate stage personally. But usually that's not an issue. It's only come up a couple of times with my students. I actually have a lot of left-handed students. I don't know about you, but I always ask about their which one is their dominant hand, or I'll notice when they're writing. And I think there's a disproportionate amount of left-handed students in my studio, but it could also
Interesting.
be
They're
because,
attracted to you. They're drawn to you as fellow lefties.
hey, yeah, maybe that could be it. That could be it.
Um, I think that one of the biggest failings in a lot of method books is not enough left-handed melodies. Because it is subtly reinforcing this concept, and it is I mean, and I can understand it because it is a real it's true. There are fewer left-hand melodies, right? There are fewer left-hand melodies, but as once you start getting into different styles, let me there are fewer left-hand melodies in a certain complexity of music from a certain time period. But it isn't true, right? Because Baroque music, we have we have contrapuntal, we have multi-part, and there's all these lovely hidden melodies in the more complex music as you start getting into multi-part writing and you get these big chords, you can voice inner lines. But one of my biggest joys in life is whenever we find a bass melody over over treble harmony. It's one of my biggest joys in life, and I always go out of my way in my own pieces, and I try to instill that in my students that there's a fragment here. It might only be a couple measures long, but there's a chromatic line here, or this left hand half note section in this Baroque piece is kind of catchy. It's kind
Hmm.
of catchy. Maybe we should bring that out. And for left-handed students, I think that's a very interesting observation. I don't have many left-handed students. I have a couple ambidextrous students, and I have a couple double jointed students that love to
Mm,
weird me out with the things their knuckles can do.
yes.
But I think that that's really interesting, and it's all about that lived it's that lived experience, that perspective, right? We have, I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in our own experiences, and for us to subtly forget that the way we experience the world is not the way that everybody experiences the world, right?
Hmm.
For example, when you have a dyslexic student, you know, you have to just always have in the back of your mind, is that note wrong because they weren't paying attention, or is that note wrong because it moved on the page? Was it wiggly
Yeah.
for them in that moment, right? I can't see the left side of the piano. I'm blind in my left eye. And that's a thing that is different for me. I mentioned that to my
Hmm.
piano teacher because that's a thing that, like, she needs to know that I can't see over there, right? I have to go entirely by touch. So with left-handed students, they have a much different
Wow.
experience than righties, right? They have a much different, they go through life. You go through life, Ariane, in a different way. You're, what is it, 7%?
Yeah. I like to tell my partner, like, until he bought me a pair of left-handed scissors for my like 26th birthday, um, I had never experienced the joy of cutting a piece of paper like properly. And I always hated scissors because just the blade, it's not even just about the handle, but the blade is on the wrong side. And so all of my paper would just look like a jumbled
Right.
up mess until I got those lefty scissors. And the other day he was like, "Oh, Ariane, I tried to use your lefty scissors for something because they're the only pair I could find and I couldn't do anything." I was like, "Welcome to my entire life."
Right, I mean,
You know?
lefties write in, I mean, I write in a such a different way. I know some left-handed people that have just, I don't want to say bizarre, but very different ways of writing so that they don't smudge
Yeah,
graphite all over their hands. So when we
that's
talk about,
me.
like, how do you, like, a student with how they write, well, maybe they don't write in the same way that you do, right? Maybe
Mhm.
they have a completely different experience from you in that way. And with dynamics, as we bring this back, with dynamics, I think that it is super important that we try to make that relevant to them. When you're trying to give examples of things, you need to make sure that the examples that you're giving are relevant to their lived experiences. Don't just assume that your examples are universal. That's how you become an out of touch uh, person that's talking about uh, 8 tracks and and the disco. You're talking about these things that you experience, right? But the people you're talking to don't really share that same experience. You don't want to be out of touch because
Mhm.
you know um, it's just not the way they experience things, right? Maybe instead of saying the character of a piece, maybe you should say the vibes. Yeah, what are the vibes of this piece like for you? That's a word that people are much more that younger people are much more familiar with, right? I think they instantly
True.
understand that, but character, what does that mean, right? So bringing
Huh.
things, making them relevant to the person you're talking to. I think that's one of the most interesting things about teaching, and it's one of the most exhausting things about teaching. And it's what makes it difficult for me to become comfortable and settle in with new students, is that you have to learn a completely new person. You have to learn about their experiences, the way they think, the way they talk, the way they what do they look like when they're paying attention, right? What do they look like when they're paying attention? Do they look at you? Do they make eye contact? Maybe they don't want to make eye contact. You shouldn't force them to make eye contact. That's ableist, right? And
Mhm.
I think that it's exhausting for me as someone on the autism spectrum to get to know people in that way in the beginning. But once you do, it's fun. It's like a form of, I don't want to misuse the term, but it feels a little bit like code switching. feels a little bit like code switching when you go from a lesson with a 6-year-old to a lesson with a 60-year-old in the span. You finish up with a 6-year-old and
Yeah.
then you start a lesson with a 60-year-old. I feel like maybe I'm misusing the term, but it feels a little bit like you're changing into a completely different person for that 60-year-old.
Oh yeah, definitely. You know, as a socially awkward person, I think that there's nothing that has been more beneficial to me in just figuring out how to be around people and building some semblance of social intuition than being a music teacher, because you see people's personalities and what they respond to, and you really do realize that everybody responds to different things, and is coming from such vastly different backgrounds, perspectives, ages, cultures, etc. Yeah, you might need to use new terminology to relate to someone. And people's taste in popular music, and by that I mean anything that's not classical, is different from generation to generation. You know, some of the stuff that I grew up thinking was the most annoying earworm type stuff in the world because I just heard it 24/7 on the Billboard top 100 whatever radio stations, is some of the stuff that now my generation alpha students feel nostalgic about. So I have to remember that, maybe some of those pop songs that I hated listening to as a teenager because they were so overplayed, that's the only reminder they have of the era when they were born and when their parents were, like having
Yeah.
them and all of that.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like some of the method books they need to do some updating in terms of their context. But
Hmm.
like give my regards to Broadway. Is that a relevant song to put into the Adult Piano Adventures book as a
I
melody
know.
that is supposed to be familiar to a young adult learning to play the piano?
I certainly had to look twice learning that because I taught that to a student just a month ago. Da 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 da. And honestly, I'm sorry for all those listeners who are familiar with that piece of music, but I hadn't heard it until I encountered it in the book, and so even the teachers were starting to not recognize the tune.
Yeah, it's certainly something to be cognizant of. But I think that it is about time for us to start doing our wrap up on this episode that was totally 100% about dynamics. Before we do our wrap ups, what do you think? Did we manage to talk about dynamics for an entire podcast episode?
You know what? We've talked about dynamics for at least a bit of it, and if we addressed it at least a few times throughout our meandering podcast, I am more than content. And I'm sure our listeners don't mind because of course they tune in for the camaraderie, the giggles,
And the spicy opinions, the very
the hot takes.
spicy the hot takes about subdivision and hands alone practice and all of that stuff. So what is your big takeaway from this episode, Ariane?
Oh yeah, the big takeaway. Almost forgot. I would say, if you're struggling with introducing concepts to more beginner students, surrounding dynamics, there are a lot of little hacks you can employ, um, including sound pictures, as I learned the proper term for them today. But I've been using sound pictures for about a decade in my teaching, just from the Faber theory book and that kind of thing. Um, and for more intermediate to advanced students, if they're having trouble with phrasing, dynamics, articulation, things like that, and juggling two hands worth of playing, definitely try out the shadow banning if you haven't already. Shadow banning. Oh,
Shadow banning,
oh no. I'm thinking too much about Meta
social
and
media.
Instagram. Oh, I meant shadow playing. Shadow ban.
Awesome. Yeah. I think that my big takeaway here is um that that it's all about who you're teaching, right? I think we constantly need to remind ourselves about who it is that we're teaching. Who are we teaching this to, right? What is the amount of context that is appropriate for this student, right? You know, you can, I'll try not to get too off topic, but like when you introduce a time signature, right? The bottom number means that a quarter note gets one beat. Okay. Do you tell a 6-year-old why the quarter note gets one beat? Or do you just tell them, look, we can draw a little imaginary quarter note at the bottom of the 4, and that means that the quarter note gets a beat? Or do you give them the math explanation, right? You need to figure out exactly what is the right amount of context to give your student. And for dynamics, I think that it is forte and piano, I think, or just loud and soft for younger students, perhaps at the beginning there. You can't have one without the other, right? It's not necessarily important when you introduce mezzo forte for you to tell them it's not really the middle. Is that really important for them to know after they've been taking lessons for 2 months that there's mezzo piano? Maybe you think it is, maybe you think that it isn't, but I think that it's fine to let them know that it's the middle. Yeah, it's in between. You don't need to say middle, but it's in between, and then you can shift the context when they're ready for that. So be okay with providing a complete but a complete view of something that feels like it makes sense, even if it's not the entire picture that you know of it. Dynamics can just be loud and soft. You don't need to tell them that it's called dynamics. You don't.
Yeah,
You can just tell them, sometimes we play music loud, sometimes we play it soft. And then even when you say forte and piano, you don't even need to say that they're called dynamics. You can wait. You can wait. Maybe you want to do it early, maybe you want to do it later. But experiment with the person you're teaching, experiment with the amount of context, their age, their learning style, and make sure that what you're teaching is relevant to the person that you are teaching it to. Teaching is not a one
definitely.
size fits all.
On that same note, I just wanted to piggyback off that and add, if you have a more advanced student, I think it's important to stress all of and make sure that they are aware of all the different kinds of musical expression and how they kind of intersect with one another. Dynamics, articulation, phrasing, the physical aspect, the visual aspect of performance, and making sure that they understand dynamics is so much more than just the sheer decibel level, but it also has to do with the emotions behind each voice in a piece and so on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you for tuning in to the Piano Pedagogy podcast, and we will see you next time.
Bye.